It's very nice to be here with all of you. This is really, for me, a wonderful experience. I have been coming to India from America since 1986. And the first 20 years of visits, really, were as a tour guide for mostly Americans, bringing them over to go to the holy places associated with the life of Paramhansa Yogananda. Calcutta, of course, is one of the most holy cities in his life because this is where he was born. Well, not where he was born, but where he spent much of his boyhood. He also had deep experiences with Ramakrishna and with Ramakrishna's disciple M. And so I have been coming to Calcutta and spending about 6 days traveling around to all of those places. Ramakrishna's Mahasamadhi place at Kasipur, the Dakshineshwar temple, all the places associated with Yogananda's life. So every time I come close to this city, I don't know what I'm relating to. It's very hard to tell because it's both the actual experiences, the memory of having had those experiences here, and also, of course, probably past lives in which I wasn't just a visitor, but I was a resident here in either this city or other cities. All of that combines to make me just extremely happy to be here. And especially happy to be here, not just in the capacity that I've come before, which is seeking inspiration, but also carrying out, as best as I am able, the commission that was given to me really at a very young age. I'm here as a representative of Swami Kriyananda, and he comes into this world as a representative of this line of gurus behind me. Those of you who've read Autobiography of a Yogi will recognize, even if you haven't, Babaji, the deathless Himalayan master, his disciple, Lahiri Mahashaya, who lived in Varanasi in the 1800s. Lahiri's disciple, Sri Yukteswar, who had his ashram not far from here in Serampore, which is another place that we visit from Calcutta, and then his disciple, Yogananda. And of course, Jesus and Krishna in the middle, not merely out of respect for their respective positions in the great spiritual traditions of East and West, but also Yogananda tells us that Krishna was a former incarnation of Babaji, and Jesus is actually part of this line of gurus, because what this work of Yogananda is about is bringing union back into the world, East and West, religions united. It's a continuation of the mission started by Ramakrishna here, who demonstrated through his own person and his own practices the unity of all religions by realizing God in each of those forms. Before I was brought to Yogananda and to Kriyananda, Ramakrishna was my guide. So when I came to this city for the first time and was able to go to Dakshineshwar especially, I felt like a child who'd come back to her mother's home, and it still stands out as one of the greatest days of my life when I was able to go there. Now, I myself am self-evidently American, and I met Swami Kriyananda, who's also American, at Stanford University in Palo Alto, California. I had been a student at Stanford. I never graduated. I lost interest in that kind of education. I went to college looking for wisdom. I found intelligence, I found knowledge, but I did not find wisdom. There was a great deal of difference. This particular topic tonight is especially dear to me because the motivating force of my life from the earliest age I can remember was that I wanted to be happy. And it absolutely astonished me that almost no one talked to me about that. And looking at everything else that was going on, I thought, what is the point of all the rest of it if on some level it doesn't make you happy? Now, as I've become more sophisticated in my understanding of life, I realize that there's something that people often call happiness, which is more like waves on the sea. And what I was really looking for was what I've come to call bliss, which you would call Satchidananda, which is that underlying consciousness, unchanging consciousness, of which everything else is just a layer over the top. The exact analogy that the masters always use, because there simply is none better, is when you look at the ocean, there's this vast body of the ocean, and on the surface all these waves move. But no matter how much those waves move, the ocean is always the same. For a period of time in my life, I learned to scuba dive, with the tank on your back and the thing in your mouth. Truthfully, I was always really scared doing it. So I did it for a little while, and my husband and I learned together, and then we both agreed that this scared us too much. No matter how much they train you, no matter how much they promise you, you're underwater, and that's not where people are meant to be. But I had some wonderful experiences, and one in particular was really remarkable. If you go, and we went to the northern part of South America and Central America, places where there's clear water and beautiful things to see. You're on the surface of the ocean. You're in this little boat, and then they, rig you up with all this stuff and throw you overboard, and you go down. An entire universe that you have no idea is under there. Even if you've gone with a mask and looking in the water, when you go down with a tank and you're just way below the surface, you're just walking around in a world that's like Calcutta, except everybody there is a fish. So it's really but their society, truthfully, looks equally complex, and the culture is very different, And so it just happens there. And then you go right back to the surface. And once you're on the surface, you don't understand the depth that's under there. The only thing you know is what's happening on the surface. One day, one of the most beautiful days we had, the whole thing was worth it for this. While we were under the water, a storm started on top of the water. So you had no way of knowing that under, but when we came up, it was this tropical rainstorm, and I came right to that point where my goggles were just at the line, and all of the raindrops hit the water and then burst upward, and it was a sunny storm. So just looking like that, there were these jewels, is what they looked like. Jewels, big jewels. Then they burst like diamonds and went out again. It was so outside of the way that we normally live and think. Our hotel, our breakfast, walking on the beach, whatever it was that we were doing there. And then all of a sudden, I'm a creature of both worlds, and diamonds are falling from the sky and exploding in front of my eyes. It was exquisite. Every so often, some aspect of God's creation communicates to us what's really going on behind it. And those moments change us forever. Now, as I was saying, all masters use the image of the ocean. Yogananda says it many, many times, because they're trying to talk to us about something that can't really be talked about. And that is sort of the problem. And it can hardly be imagined, because we're so accustomed to just living in the world, identifying with the human body that we're in, defining ourselves by the reality that we live in. It's very hard to grasp in our minds that the whole thing simply needs to be turned around. There's a verse in the Bhagavad Gita, a very famous verse for very good reason. What is day to the man of worldly interests is night to the devotee who seeks God. And what is night to the devotee is day to the person of worldly interests. You can quote that I can quote that. It tells us that the whole understanding is flipped. But nonetheless, every day it's hard to remember that. Even when I would come out from under that deep ocean and be back on the surface, it was just very hard to believe and remember that that whole world was going on, and I could no longer perceive it anymore. At least I had seen it, so I could remember it, and when we would go back and look at it again, it was more familiar. But still, nothing on the surface of the sea told us about it. In countless ways, the masters come into this world. These gurus who stand behind me, it's important whenever we speak, we put these pictures here. These pictures are large for this room, and you know, I'm only just a little bigger than they are, physically even, and much smaller spiritually. But I'm really glad that they're here, because it's very important for all of us to understand that we're just talking about what they know. And I was starting to say to you, very early in my life, I was commissioned. I met Swami Kriyananda when I was 22. I had been given Autobiography of a Yogi, but I had started, my spiritual life started with Vivekananda, who's very straightforward and, you know, very strong-minded. You all know this is his city. You know, the power of his mind, which appealed to me because I was of a similar temperament. And I became very austere, very pure about what I was interested in. I misunderstood him, is what I really want to say. I just made him after my own image, as people do. We like something and then we make it out like ourselves. But when I read Yogananda's book, which of course is the same teaching and presented with a different voice, but the same truths. But he starts right in on page 8 of Autobiography of a Yogi. Yogananda's father is with a fellow disciple of Lahiri Mahashaya, and Lahiri Mahashaya materializes in a field of grass. It was a little hard for me as an American woman, so I closed the book. I just put it on my shelf. And then I met Swami Kriyananda, and being who he is, with a very strong, highly educated mind, very strong intellect also. And he talked to me about what Yogananda was like, the way he talked yesterday, for those of you who were here and heard him speak. And something connected for me that hadn't connected before. This is the way I've come to learn, you know, spiritual truth is transmitted. It's not only transmitted directly, you know, from the masters, but it's transmitted person to person among all of us, because we're sometimes closer to each other than any of us are to the masters. And also, sometimes people ask me, how can I tell which spiritual path is my path? How can I tell which guru I should follow? It's a very good question, of course. And we can tune into the masters from the heart, from the spiritual eye. We can read their writings, we can meditate on their pictures. But another very important way to tell is you look at the people who follow that path. Because those who follow the path with dedicated determination are the fruit of that particular teaching. And if you like what you see, and I'm not speaking only of myself, I'm talking of Swami Kriyananda, I'm talking of all the devotees, but people who follow the path show you who you will become. Because every path has its own feeling about it. It's just like families and marriages, and that many people exist in the world, but somehow or another we form into these little groups, and then we have an affinity for one another. And so it is spiritual families even more powerfully. Physical families you may only have to experience for one incarnation. Maybe you'll get to experience them for more, but there's no guarantee. Spiritual families you have forever. So you have to learn to get along, among other things. But the point being, there's a quality about it. And what Swami Kriyananda brought into the room the first time I saw him was exactly what I had been looking my whole life for somebody to teach me. I'll put it in really simple terms. This was a happy man. And not happy, just like cheerful kind of person, like everything went well today, and therefore I'm cheerful. He brought into that room what I would call an ocean of joy. He brought in the whole undercurrent of reality that some part of my intuition always knew was there, but it was so confusing, growing up in the West especially, that, well, mostly people simply didn't know. When I was younger, I used to think that all the adults around me actually had the secret of happiness, but it was sort of going to be like at a certain age they would initiate me into it, you know? Maybe the day I became a woman or something like that. And then they would all teach me the only thing worth knowing. And it was very disconcerting for me as I grew old enough to realize that they weren't telling me because they didn't know. And even in a deeper sense, it's like they'd almost given up hoping that there was such an answer, which to me was just totally unacceptable. This, of course, steeped as I am now in these teachings, tells me I had past life as a past lives as a yogi. I've been on this path for a long time. I was born in California to help Swami Kriyananda with these communities. Who knows why? But this teaching, because as soon as someone put in my hand Vivekananda's book, there was no interlude of conversion. The book was handed to me, I opened it, I exhaled. Finally, somebody was teaching me what I wanted to know. And I devoted myself to that path it was about 4 years before Swami Kriyananda and Yogananda came into my life, and then I saw that I was being taken care of by Ramakrishna to be given to Yogananda. At the time, I didn't exactly know, but I sort of, I said to them, I don't know, this is your problem. You sort this out. I knew I wanted to be with Kriyananda. I knew I wanted to help the communities, and everything was true, and I just knew it would make itself clear to me, which it did very easily in a matter of a short period of time. Now, let me just go back to the thought that I wanted here. Hold on just a moment. Oh, yes. I was remembering, actually, almost two of my earliest memories as a small child. My mother scolded me once, and I was small enough, probably about this big. I was small enough to be able to curl up on the floor of the back seat of the car, half the floor there, and fit very comfortably, so it was quite little. My brother and I were no doubt pounding on each other in the back seat, as we were inclined to do. It was always his fault from my point of view, but perhaps not always so. He would torment me, and then I would become upset. And my mother, from the front seat, spoke sharply to us, and I'm sure it was entirely deserved. But nonetheless, it hurt my feelings. I was always very tender. And I didn't like that feeling of hurt. And I got down on the back seat of the car. We didn't have seat belts or car seats then. And I put my head down on the little hump that was between, where I could hear the sound of the tires, which I really actually honestly recognize now as I was listening to the Om, because there was something just so comforting in that. And then I remember, was I 2, was I 3 years old? I remember thinking, the hurt that I'm feeling is only on the surface. I didn't have words like surface of my consciousness, but that's what I knew. I knew that there was an outer edge of me, and my mother had hurt my feelings. But if I curled up and listened to that sound and went deeper and deeper, I would find the part of me that was untouched by anything that had happened to me. The only answer to that is that I knew that from before. But it's always been so fascinating to me, and that moment stuck in my mind, that some part of me knew that what happens on the surface is not as real, as penetrating as it seems, because it is exactly that. It's on the surface. And there's always a place in us that is untouched. Now, even then, and I don't want to give my baby self too much credit, but it's important to realize that the full intelligence of a person is completely present, even in a newborn infant. They just don't have language. They don't have context. They can't really tell it to you. But everything that is ever going to be accessible is accessible to them. And that memory, that whatever happens on the surface, there's always a place where everything is, I know what I wanted to say. And it's not by any means the thought that they speak of in psychology or something like that, where you, quote, disassociate from the pain that you're experiencing. That's something I learned, many years later in my life. If young children are subjected to something that's too traumatic for them, they will disassociate from their own personality in order to survive that. So it happens to someone else and they live over here. But that is not an expansion of consciousness. That's a fracturing of consciousness. That's a dulling down of your sensitivity that later in your life you have to go back and recollect it. It's very important to understand the distinction. What I was doing, and this is what I later learned is classic spiritual practice, is I was expanding my sense of identity from the point of pain to the larger reality in which that point of pain still existed, but now it was in a completely different context. I have one more childhood story which I'll share, and then I'll go on. I don't know what age I was. Again, I was very small. I can say my sister wasn't born yet, so that dates it. I must have been 3 or 4. I had this, what in child's memory was this huge shelf of toys. Probably it was not nearly as large as I remember it. I have always had, and I have finally learned to discipline myself, energy in impulsive bursts, and then it used to peter out. Now I'll say I'm able to stick with things. So I had this idea, even as a child, I was going to clean my toy shelf. And I started, in typical fashion, by just pulling everything off and piling it into the middle of the room. Now the shelf was empty and there was a huge mess in the middle, at which point I lost interest in the project and wandered off to do something else. Somewhere in there, my mother came and perceived what I had started and not finished, and being a very good mother, she brought me back and told me that I had to put it all back. She wasn't going to put it all back. I'd made such a mess. And I remember, just as children do, just taking this as such a tragic imposition on my life. And I remember sitting there, how children try to make themselves cry. And then I would lift one toy as if it weighed 1,000 pounds, and I would just tragically lift it and flop it on the shelf and then collapse again in my despair. And then I remember, in the midst of that, another complete part of me said, oh, just cut it out and put them back on the shelf. Why are you allowing this completely superficial thing to influence your happiness? There's nothing happening here. Just you took the toys off the shelf, put them back on the shelf. I don't think I followed that. But it was, again, fascinating to me in retrospect, because we can say, oh, putting toys on a shelf, being scolded by your mother, we can call these things trivial, but they're not trivial in the life of a child who has no sense of time and no sense of yesterday or tomorrow, just lives entirely in this moment, and whatever is happening is total. Most of you have probably raised children, and any of you have seen children, you know what they're like. They were adults, they would be institutionalized. I mean, they're just like, with few exceptions, they're just completely crazy in the way they have no sense of proportion. Of course, they're children. You don't expect them to be otherwise. Every experience is total. Total tragedy. And when they get to be teenagers, it gets to be even more interesting because they're bigger and stronger. As one of my friends who was a high school principal put it, he said, during the adolescent years, teenagers completely, I think even in your culture, they run a little more smoothly, but in America, teenagers shoot off like fireworks. Maybe it's the same here now. But they put on personalities just to test them out, to decide who they're going to become. And whatever personality has been assumed, even though it was only assumed 5 minutes ago, it's the only personality they have ever had or ever will have. So if you challenge any aspect of it, like today you're going to be an astronaut and yesterday you were going to be a musician, they'll just become completely outraged that you don't believe them, you don't take them seriously. He was a great help to all the parents of my my friends who have had teenage children. I've never raised children. Because he just said, you have to take them in the world in which they live, which is the now. Well, you might see where I'm going with this, which is that even though our bodies are now adult bodies, and many of you probably have very highly advanced degrees or very responsible jobs or accomplished great things in our lives, many of these same misunderstandings just permeate our consciousness. And if it wasn't for the writings of the masters, if it wasn't for the intervention of the scriptures, we would have no idea. And most of the people on this planet with us really have no idea. They're taking life exactly as it's offered to them. And this is what you do. You need money for your family. You need this, you need that. And happiness is pleasure above all, however that pleasure is defined. For many people, pleasure is to become unconscious, to drink, to take drugs, to eat foods that dull your awareness, to watch television. That's the most thing. I mean, you just have this desire, and you'll even say it, I just want to check out for a while. That's what people say. And we define pleasure as an escape from the necessity to be aware. And otherwise, people, or people will simply think, what I was saying is that people take pleasure, but they define the pleasure as what's accessible through my physical body in the obvious reality that I'm living in right now. And people to whom it has not yet occurred that there is a depth to the ocean will just live on the surface of the sea, and when you talk to them about other realities, they may, in the Indian culture, they may know about these things, but as Swamiji often says, you can live next door to the best restaurant in the city. You can have the menu memorized, but if you're not hungry, you won't go in, and you'll never order and you'll never eat. But there comes a time, and this is globally the only unifying factor I've ever been able to find for people who are drawn to our teachings. Where I live in California, I live right in the middle of Silicon Valley, where I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, I'm just going to say where every one of you has a relative. I'm absolutely certain. There's not a single Indian person who has ever visited me who doesn't at least have a friend of a relative or a relative where I am. Where people don't automatically think of spiritual practice or of self-realization. It's not the city of Ramakrishna. It's just a very different reality. But at some point, no matter what culture you're in, because being raised here merely makes it a little easier to know where you're looking, but it doesn't necessarily make you hungrier. It just makes you more conscious of what's on the menu, right? And in fact, the way the world is working right now, where India is needing, as Swami Kriyananda puts it, needing to take its place, its appropriate place in the world, by coming up materially and modernizing and coming in much more into the culture around it, which is just so self-evidently. I've been coming here since 1986, and the year that India opened to foreign corporations happened in the middle of my cycle of leading pilgrimages here, and it was just a night and day difference. And it was the right thing to do because we are a global society now. But the end point of all of this, at a certain point it occurs to us that what's happening to me from the outside appears to be causing the way I feel on the inside, but in fact, the way I feel on the inside, at least in theory, is actually independent of what happens to me. Yogananda said something that was so fascinating. It might even be in one of these little books that we have that this class is all based on, this series of books of words of Yogananda. He said, because on this plane of consciousness, we exist in the dimension of time, even though time is an illusion, and if we have time tonight or another time, if we have time tonight to talk about the illusion of time, or if not now, we'll do it another time. I can talk to you a little bit about that, but let's just say the masters all say that the past, present, and future is a feature of this plane of consciousness. And it's just a feature of its consciousness. It's not an inherent reality. So as Yogananda put it, things in this world seem to happen one after another. That's how we experience it. I'm sure all of you, I was in the taxi, we got out of the taxi, we came into the room here, time passed, you all are with me now, we'll be here for a while, eventually we'll all separate. All these things happen sequentially. Everything in our lives does. Yogananda gave us the utterly intriguing statement, because things happen sequentially, we have the impression that one thing causes another. It's like your mind says, but of course it does. But when the master says that's only an impression, even if you don't know what he's talking about, you have to think maybe there's a world under the surface of the ocean that I don't even know about. And all of us have certainly experienced what I was describing from my early childhood. Just this sudden realization that what I am experiencing is not the only thing that could be experienced in this moment. My mother has hurt my feelings. I don't like having my feelings hurt. I can change my experience of this moment from that which I perceive to be unpleasant, unpleasurable, to something that I will enjoy experiencing. I mean, my understanding was deeply yogic, but we all notice that. Or this unpleasant task was imposed upon me. You know, the fact that these are childhood events somehow make the whole picture so much more clear. There it was, and I was choosing to suffer. And even in the moment, I could tell that suffering was a choice. That all I really had to do was put my toys on the shelf. What was so hard about that? But I was converting that into a very difficult experience. By my own will, I was doing that. Now, right there is the whole spiritual path. And what I was saying a moment ago, the unifying feature of what draws people together to be on the spiritual search is that somewhere along the line, it's really seriously crossed our minds that the inner world is the world that I should attend to. Because if I attend to the inner world, then everything about the outer world, well, many things will happen. Among others, it will come more under my control. Because if you really think about it, all we actually ever experience is the inside of our own consciousness. We're all sitting in this room together, and all of you individually are listening to essentially the same talk. Those of you who speak American English are hearing more words than those of you who speak Indian English, and I'm doing my best to articulate and talk slowly enough. But still, everybody is drawing from this experience and having in this moment, if you're hungry, if you're hot, if you're sleepy, if you're angry at somebody, if you're worried about your children, all of those experiences are happening at the same time. And our ability even to communicate with each other is entirely dependent on each of our individual worlds. Now, the beginning of the spiritual path is to grasp on a combination of intellect and intuition. Both of those are necessary. And to grasp really, really strongly with the heart that if I change my consciousness, I change everything, and that it is possible to change my consciousness, and it is worth the effort. And standing here before you, that's really 100% of what my intention is for tonight. Just somehow to collectively have us all understand that if we change our consciousness, we change everything, that it's possible to do that, and that it's worth the effort. I was born knowing this. I just had to wait until I was 22, well, 18 really, because Vivekananda told me first. And Vivekananda told me in theory, because of course I'm living in California and he's already off the planet, and all I have is his books. And for 4 years, I just kept thinking, how do you do this? All I had was words. I couldn't figure out how to get my hand on it, how to really make it happen. And then when Swami Kriyananda walked into the room, it was the first time in my life that I saw someone who had accomplished it. I mean, one can put enormous spiritual words around his consciousness, which I'm more than willing to do and have done. But it really came down to the fact that he had gained mastery of his inner world. And the hardest thing for us actually to believe, strangely, and even more important than how to do it, is to believe that it can be done and that it's worth doing. Because if we don't think it can be done and we don't think it's worth doing, we're not hungry. Or we're hungry in the sense of, I'd like to have room service come in, but I don't want to pay for it, right? I just want the meal delivered, but I don't really want to have to earn any money. I don't even want to have to make the phone call. I just want it to happen. I've been very amused. There's a woman in the community where I live. She's a very dear soul, and we've become really good friends over time. Every single satsang, every single question and answer, she would ask me the same question. She was intelligent enough, and if you ever, because this is being filmed and she'll probably watch it, she's a dear friend of mine, so. She's highly intelligent, very educated. I'll give her all the credit in the world. Every time she would ask me a question, it was the same question. Isn't there an easier way to do this? I keep trying, and I've been trying for a day. I've been trying for a week. I've been trying for a year. And I'm not different yet. Isn't there an easier way? Honey, if I knew it, I'd tell you, I promise. Why would I hold it back from you? But how to be happy all the time is the absolute promise of the masters, and they show it to us. I'm sure most of you were there yesterday listening to Swami Kriyananda talk, and he just told us story after story after story about the consciousness of his guru as he knew him. And we all felt, because Swami Kriyananda has the consciousness of his guru, we just felt that unconditioned bliss just coming out from him, which is what Swami Kriyananda brought into the room in November of 1969. He was born with it, and it was right there even then. And the reason the masters incarnate is because with that visible example, and we're very close to the incarnation of Yogananda. We have someone still living who actually knew him. My own life, intersected with his on the planet, but I never met him. I was, hundreds of miles away and just didn't have the destiny to do that. But he's close enough to us in time that we have his voice, we have his pictures, his moving pictures, we have his writing. But above all, what that all means to us, and what we think it's supposed to mean is we're supposed to fall at his feet, we're supposed to worship, we're supposed to beg for his intercession. All of these are not such a bad idea if you have the chance. But what we're really supposed to take from that is that it's possible. And, in the course of these several days of classes, I hope to have an opportunity to talk about many aspects of this path through the subjects that I'm speaking about, because one of the extraordinarily unusual aspects of what Yogananda taught, especially the way Kriyananda has interpreted it, is that it's not a question of ancient tradition. It's not a question of complicated symbols that have to be dismantled in order for us to understand what we're looking at. It's been completely translated into intellectually graspable ideas that lead to a shift in consciousness. You see, it's a very interesting combination. It's not just intellectual ideas that we spin and spin. All of them are grounded in a practical change of consciousness. Now, here's a fascinating fact about an avatar, which all of you know, but it's really amazing to think about it. An avatar is a self-realized being. In the West, because the only avatar that people really talk about is Jesus, and because Jesus spoke symbolically about being the only Son of God, he was speaking of his state of consciousness, which was Christ consciousness, Krishna consciousness, it's the same word, that he was one with the Father because of his realization. Because in the West there's just Jesus, and he appeared out of nowhere, and and this is the fundamental Christian teaching, there was nobody before him and nobody after him. They were spared having to make any sense out of him. He just popped in, and there he is. I hope I'm not being rude to those of you who are Christian by your devotion. It's not, I have a deep devotion to Christ. It's the lack of understanding in the churches I'm speaking about, not Jesus himself. So they have no idea what a self-realized master is, absolutely none. And it cripples their spiritual practice, because Jesus just appeared, and by his mercy, you'll be saved. But there's no process. There's no sadhana. There's no progression of consciousness. And also, we only have one incarnation, and wow, that's really a tough one, because you don't get very far in one incarnation, so you just hope to go to heaven at the end. However, coming back to where we really need to be, once you integrate the teachings of Jesus with the teachings of Sanatana Dharma and really start understanding what a master is a self-realized being. He is an individual soul, in his essence not different from any of us. One of the rituals that we often do, the Festival of Light, has a statement, God loves everyone equally. He loves each person, no matter how badly they behave. We are all equal before God, equal to the great masters. We are not equal in realization, but we are equal in potential. So by the time a soul reaches perfect freedom, that means he's lived through everything that we've lived through. That's just an amazing thing to contemplate. You're working in an office and your job is really boring and your boss is impossible. It's hard to think that Paramhansa Yogananda in some incarnation worked in an office with a boss that was impossible, or the vibrational equivalent, let's put it that way. The state of delusion between realization and lack of understanding that any of us experience, it's not merely that the masters have compassion, they've actually been there. They've lived through these states of realization. The importance of that cannot be overestimated, not for any reason to change your devotion to them. So when the master then tells you, things appear to cause one another, but they're just because they're happening in sequence. Or when the master says to you, it's perfectly possible at all times to not allow circumstances to touch your inner bliss. They're not just sort of saying that to make us feel incompetent. They're actually telling us what they actually know from their actual experience. And even more profoundly, at least for me, this thought which I'm sharing with you has influenced me. It means that it's possible to get there from here. Wherever I'm standing, however completely out of control this situation seems to me, the master stood here, he walked through it, and he got to a state of perfect bliss. Now, to be happy all the time, first of all, we have to believe that it's possible. I said that a moment ago. We have to understand that it's a matter of our own consciousness. And then, here's a very important word. We have to have the courage to face into that fact, which means that we have to start working with and on ourselves to change our inner reality. And the deeply held identification with the outside world as causing our experiences we have to respect how challenging that is, or else we do not put out enough energy to overcome it. One of the reasons we have to know what the obstacles are is that if I go, this happened to me once, and actually I hurt my back for a really long time. There was this really big box. I didn't know how much it weighed. I very casually, in kind of a twisted way, bent over and tried to pick it up, and oh my gosh, I staggered home and went to bed like this because I didn't know what I was dealing with. And so a lot of times in our spiritual lives, we make a little effort to shift our consciousness, but we don't really know what we're dealing with. We don't realize, we don't stop and think, let me put it that way, how many incarnations we spent getting all the way to this point of total confusion, right? We've invested a tremendous amount in who we've become. Now, I don't think that's not to me bad news, because whatever we've become has brought us to the point where we want to expand beyond it. But it's a heavy box, and we're not going to be able to lift it by just kind of casually leaning over with a twisted spine and just thinking we can move it, which is, the first time something goes wrong, just sort of imagine that it won't work. This needs to become, on our part, a deeply systematic, committed way of living, and I'm going to give you a very important principle. You have to practice when it's easier. There's certain little things that I call the gospel of Asha. The gospel of Asha is practice when it's easier. You will hear me say this if we stay together for any period of time, over and over. People will come to me. I've done counseling and teaching for many decades now, because, as I started to say, as soon as I met Swami Kriyananda, I was drawn right into his company, and I heard him teach a lot. And very, very quickly, I could see that it was being given to me to pass on. It was whatever was coming in was meant to go out. And I have been as conscientious as I could be about that. And the other reason I stand in front of these masters is this has nothing to do with me. I just had the opportunity to be very well trained by a very good teacher, and I just want to pass it on to you, exactly what's happening. And I've figured out some little aphorisms. So people will have come to me many times over the years, and of course, the reason we come, we never really, if we can get away with not changing, we try not to change. That's just the way it is. The preference for the known misery. However miserable it is, at least it's familiar. And Master writes in the book, How to Have Courage and Calmness, which is coming a little later, even if it's miserable, at least it's familiar. And often we prefer to cling to the familiar misery than risk the possibility of change. But when the misery becomes intense, when someone that you love dies, when financial difficulties besiege you, when health happens, when someone you care about is suffering, when relationships become painful, whatever it might be, then often people will seek help. And in the position I've been in life, many, many people will come to me come to me over the years. And they'll often bring a big box, just an impossible marital situation, an impossible relationship with a parent, an impossible health, whatever it might be. It's a big box that's carried in and dropped in the middle. And usually it's too big to lift. That's generally why they've come in. They've dragged it, might be more fair. But it's interesting to me that whatever the biggest issues in our lives are, when I began to try to tune into this more sensitively, I could always see that it was a trend that often stretched out into the smaller issues of our lives. I noticed this first in myself. I have had certain personality issues to overcome, misunderstandings. We all do. I'm by no means on the level where I haven't and don't struggle with what everyone else struggles with. I've been fortunate to have been in the company of a great teacher, and I remember what he says and I can tell it to you. I have not realized what he has realized. I don't want there to be any misunderstanding on that. But I have certain character flaws that I have had to struggle with for my life. I've made notable progress by the grace of God and Guru, I will say. But it was very interesting to me to realize once that I chose to incarnate into a family that made my faults worse. And when I started knowing about reincarnation and consciously choosing a birth that would be of benefit to you, I thought, what a stupid choice. Why didn't I go into a family that would have balanced all those faults instead of just making them worse and worse? I mean, I really pondered that for a long time. Were you drunk in the astral world? What were you thinking? And I even have made resolutions. Next time I want my family to be like this and to teach me this. And then one day I had just a shocking realization, which is that if my family hadn't pushed me farther in that wrong direction, the pain of that wrong direction would not have become intense enough for me to put out the effort to try to shift it. You see? Because we only act, Swamiji was talking about this yesterday, we only act for one of two reasons: to escape pain, to experience happiness, however we call that happiness. And if the pain is not strong enough, we want to be motivated by the desire for bliss, but very often we're motivated by the desire to escape pain. As we advance, we may be going more consciously toward bliss, but in the meantime, we get pushed from the back. So in my own life, I saw that because my family exaggerated those wrong qualities in me, they just got bigger and bigger in my life. And finally they reached the point where I could see the degree to which they were making me miserable. Prior to that, they were just my characteristics. I didn't even know. I even thought they were my friends. The mind is so confusing. Okay, but what I'm coming to in this is, what I learned from that is that we have these threads that run through. And usually when you have a big issue, something that makes you miserable a lot, you'll realize that you're acting in the same way in lots of small ways. I'll give you a specific example. A woman came to me with the most complicated situation with her mother, extremely difficult to sort out. But the main thing that it had brought out in her was this sense of resentment against the way she was treated. And there was really nothing we could do about her mother. It was just too big for the conversation. So I just started asking her, at work, when you think that your coworker hasn't contributed as much as you have, how do you feel about them? Well, I get very resentful. When you're on the highway and somebody cuts you off, what's your first response when you're with a bad driver? Well, it makes me angry that they treated me that way. When you go into the coffee room at work and people have left their cups in there. In other words, everywhere she turned, she was having the same response. And so I suggested that she practice where it was easier. Because our consciousness, which feels to us like such a fixed reality, is actually a totally moving target. It is a flow of energy. It's waves on the sea. And it follows certain patterns. And later in the week, we're having classes on karma and reincarnation and also the chakras. And when, I'm going to have lots of fun by saying, I'll tell you about that later. And so that's going to get me off the hook with a whole lot of this. But both karma and reincarnation and the chakras, I'll put on the board what I will call the metaphysics of how this works. Because the metaphysics of it are extremely helpful in understanding how to unravel it also. But the main point we have to understand is our consciousness is a flow of energy, and it's a flow of energy that is dictated by the vrittis, the whirlpools of habit, which are actually karma in the chakras, that draw that consciousness continually into the same pattern. Thinking of it like this, if you have a river running where our community is up in the hills of Nevada City in California, the Yuba River is a big river that runs there. Well, you have the Ganges, you have all the rivers here too. The rivers there running through a canyon as they do. Often there's a rock or something like that that will create a whirlpool in the side. I've been in the Ganges here. I've seen how every river does that. So the river's trying to go in this direction, but something grabs a piece of the river, doesn't it? A rock gets planted, debris gets started, a little dam is built, whatever it is. So the free flow of that river is interrupted. And it'll whirl sometimes. It'll make a whirlpool like that. If the obstacles to the flow of the river are removed, the whirlpool simply disappears and goes back into the river. It's just a relationship of force to force, magnetism to magnetism when we're just talking energy. The only thing that diverts the water is that something over here captures it. So our consciousness is a river flowing. It's literally, it's the energy flowing up the spine trying to reach the spiritual eye. Our consciousness is our individual bubble in the ocean trying to get to the sea. Every single river flows to the sea. Every bubble of consciousness is flowing to Satchidananda. We're just like the current of the river. No matter which way it's going, it's heading for the sea. No matter which way we're going, we're heading for Satchidananda, for the ocean of bliss. But it can get really diverted into these whirlpools. And so what we have to understand in our own consciousness, not in a river is a physical thing. Our consciousness is not physical. It's a flow of energy. And whatever energy patterns we have built up, if we keep repeating the same actions, holding the same thoughts, clinging to the same desires, then our energy whirls around it. This is what's happening literally with the vrittis and the chakras. It whirls around that, and to that extent the river can't flow. We're blocked from our effort to get to Satchidananda. Now, the way we can get rid of a whirlpool is very simple. We begin to pull out of it what's holding it at the center. So if we have the habit of responding, as I was saying, in a resentful way to the circumstances of our life, what we're doing is the river tries to flow, something happens, and we say, I don't like that. These people are treating me badly. I'm angry about this. And every time we do that, we deposit magnetic energy into that whirlpool, and so every time the river goes by that, it gets sucked into it again. Now, if we've been doing that, even just for one incarnation, what to speak of many, it's a strong habit. And we can't really dismantle it by saying, oh, I think I won't feel that way anymore. It's just not that easy, because we have deposited a tremendous amount of our self into that. And so we have to begin to take it apart. But every time we do anything that relates to that attitude, we build it up again. And every time we resist falling into that same trap, it's not only that we diminish that, but we begin to change the whole magnetism of who we are. Because The natural direction of the river is to the sea. So you see, all the whirlpools are the exception. The natural direction is to the sea. So even if you think, just being nice to my coworkers who left their coffee cups in the sink has nothing to do with my fury at my mother or my husband or whoever it is over here, but in fact it has everything to do with it, because you're beginning to dismantle that whirlpool. Because the whirlpool is not your mother, your father, or the dirty coffee cups. The whirlpool is the inclination to believe that my consciousness is controlled by the circumstances of my life. And all of the masters tell us that life is just one thing after another that has no quality to it until we, by our preferences, assign a quality to it. Yogananda said, circumstances are always neutral. They appear happy or sad because of the happy or sad inclination of the mind. Now, is that a challenging teaching? Yes. Will we spend the rest of our lives working on it? Yes. But you see, that's the good news. Is that this is not just a little sort of small, oh, that's a nice idea. This is going to the very center of who we are and why we are that way, and beginning to turn it in the direction that we want to turn it. And again, I will repeat it, once we start doing that, we're going in the natural direction of the river. Sri Yukteswar has a beautiful phrase which is like a mantra you want to repeat. Everything in future will improve if I'm making the right spiritual effort now. So you cannot overestimate. In fact, it's stunning how much you can change and shift your life just by the smallest effort, merely even by accepting the idea that this is within my control. And this is a choice that I'm making. And no matter how complex the edifice I've built, I can pull it apart piece by piece, and the grace of God will just collapse it around me, and I will be able to flow to the sea as if none of this ever happened. Now, so let me just get one last thought here. Let me think how to say this. Oh, I'll give you one more thought, because I want to leave you with something concrete. The first is practice when it's easier. The second thing is realize that whatever large issues in your life are making you unhappy, if you watch, you will see that they are also the small issues of your life. Don't worry about the large ones, just go to the small ones, because that will begin to change the trend of your consciousness. You'll begin to create a new habit for yourself. But the third point is, it doesn't really matter. You don't have to do anything perfectly. The word is directional. This is one of Swami Kriyananda's enormous contributions to spiritual understanding. It's not either or. Oh, I was furious and had a terrible attitude. Look at me, I'm nearly an angel. Rarely are those the choices. It's like, I have a terrible attitude. Let me see if I can make it a little less bad. Okay, there's always, in every situation, there's always going to be a polarity. Everything is dual. So whatever situation you're in, there's the worst you could behave and the best you're capable of behaving. Not the best that you can imagine someone could behave, but the best that you're capable of behave. Here's my perfect example. I don't really have a major issue with eating the wrong foods. I was born as a person who likes really healthy food. But, everybody has their weaknesses. So there's certain kinds of candies or something that I just really love, peanut brittle and a few others that, please don't bring me any, just that sort of thing. There's a Calcutta sweet that tastes really just fabulous to me, but I don't know the name of it. Actually, Ashish's wife brought it to me, so I don't think it was from Calcutta. She said it was from her home country. Anyway, somebody can bring me a bag of that, and I'm sunk. As long as it's in the house, it's going to be in my tummy. Right? So I may not be capable of throwing away the whole thing, but I've literally done this. I empty half the bag into the garbage disposal and turn it on, right? And then I just have half the bag left. Okay? The best thing might have been to not have it at all, but better than eating the whole bag, is I disposed of half of the bag, right? Or I'm very angry at someone. That's not really my issue, so I don't really want to say it like that. But let's say you are angry or annoyed with someone. Instead of just absolutely exploding in the worst possible way, you go home and thoughtfully write them a mean letter. Okay? We haven't reached the level of the masters, but we're moving in the right direction. So just recognizing for yourself, just practice on the small things and realize that if I'm better than my worst, I'm doing well. Because one of the main reasons I have seen people defeated spiritually is they set unrealistic goals for themselves, totally fail to reach them, and then they're utterly justified in quitting. It's very self-serving because then you get to stay just the same. If you're actually serious about being happy all the time, try to be happy some of the time. And then once you get in the habit, then the kind of change that these masters promise, that Kriya Yoga practice promises, is slow and steady but eternal. And inasmuch as time is an illusion, and it's always now, we think, I want it now, and if I can't have it now, I'm just going to go back to the way I was. But slow and steady, that really lasts forever, means that the now that you live in every day gets to be a better now. So with my whole heart, I encourage you, think seriously. And I believe we may have some books, and if we don't have them tonight, we'll have them tomorrow. Yogananda has a little book. Every class I'm giving, there's a Yogananda book. These are unpublished except in these books, writings from talks and other things they said, just pithy aphorisms that really focus in very closely on the points that we're talking about. Take it seriously, because it is the promise of the masters, and everything in future will improve. I was a little child who wanted to be happy. I met Swami Kriyananda, and there he was, a genuinely happy man who's been through incredibly difficult things in his life, just extraordinary difficult, and hasn't always on the surface of the sea been completely sunny. In fact, interestingly, he describes that during the worst period of his life, when everything on the surface was just terrible, he said he was almost perplexed to realize that underneath all that misery there was joy, because there was a huge storm raging on the surface of the sea. But merely because we have to pilot a ship through a huge storm doesn't mean that we have to be different in the depths of our being. What a promise. I mean, think about that. That's what really captures you on the spiritual path. Think about what that really means. Yogananda puts it this way: you should have enough strength to stand unshaken amidst the crash of breaking worlds. Wow. How do we get there? Well, he got there from here. And if we follow the path that he offers us, we will get there from here. And when we are there, it will be now. And we won't even remember then. We'll just be in that. And that's the divine promise. Well, I would take just a couple of questions if there are any. Yes, this man is right there. What do you want?
What if someone tells you, I can't change?
I can't change?
I can't change.
Uh-huh.
And you need to change for me.
Yes. Uh-huh. Well, the good news is that the full question? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Lots of people tell you it's your fault. What was I saying a few minutes ago? Only a few people on the planet actually consider their consciousness to be their personal responsibility. Almost everyone believes that they're suffering. This is the way I put it. There was a couple in America who got married and divorced almost immediately because neither of them, and this is the way I put it, knew where their unhappiness actually came from. They were two unhappy people. They married each other. They continued to make each other unhappy, so they decided that the other person was making them unhappy. So as you can do in America, they just separated. Their unhappiness, they had failed to notice that they brought it into the relationship, and what each other was doing to each other had nothing to do with their unhappiness, but he said this and I hurt, she said that and I hurt, so they thought they were causing it. Most of the planet thinks that that's true. And so most of the planet, it's a stage of spiritual growth. It's actually, I don't know if we'll ever get to talking about this, but when Yogananda talks about the caste system, not the incredibly complicated, detailed, but the overall caste system, the level of the Vaishya, the merchant class, believes that happiness and unhappiness comes from the external conditions of life, and believes if they can control the external conditions, then the internal will be fine. So the Vaishya tries to accumulate money, he tries to have a big house, he tries to control everyone around him. The trouble is, it doesn't work, because those pesky other people just keep behaving the way they're going to behave. You know, it's so annoying, isn't it? My dear husband said to me once, he's so marvelous, "Honey, you're not right as often as you think you are." Oh, it was perfect. He doesn't talk, I mean, I use I use 1,000,000 words to one of his. But when he lines them up, he lines them up really well, and they go right to the point. I'm not right as often as I think I am. But that's how people are. And I'll tell you another strange experience, and then I'll go back to your answer. We were actually in a motorhome on a curving mountain road. It was a big motorhome. I was in the back. It was big enough to have a kitchen, and I was making a peanut butter sandwich with this jar, which was a 1-pound peanut butter jar. He made a sort of slight, too fast turn. He actually had drifted, and then he turned it. Suddenly he was driving. The peanut butter jar slid right off the counter, hit me right on the foot. And it was heavy enough, and it hurt. And I had this impulse to yell at him. But it was so interesting to me that I watched it. It was like an accident. It just all slowed down. I had an actual pain in my foot, and I thought if angry words came out of my mouth, my foot would hurt less. And somehow that whole subconscious connection just went like that. And I also had the thought that my foot hurts, I want to hurt him. I mean, that's nothing to be proud of, but that was the way the energy was flowing. I have pain, if I can impose it on you, somehow I'll have less. Now, in the circumstances, it was so stupid that I just saw immediately that the peanut butter jar on my foot had nothing to do with angry words coming out of my mouth. But boy, did that make an impression on me. Because how often do people hurt, and they take their hurt and they try to push it on you in the belief that somehow they'll feel better inside. And they believe that the only reason they feel badly is because of your behavior. And if you just change your behavior, then I'll be happy. Number one, it won't make them happy, because you're not really making them unhappy. They're just unhappy. That's the problem to begin with. I think when someone says that to you, you have to think, are they telling me the truth? Is the suggestion that they're making for the shift in my behavior something that would benefit me? And if it's a good suggestion, don't resist it merely because it was offered to you, even if the motive was bad. But if somebody is asking you to do something that's inappropriate, I'll just end with that word. It's an inappropriate request because you can't do it, you don't want to do it, you know it's just going to lead to another inappropriate request. You just have to be calmly, strongly, kindly in yourself. But I mean, we're giving another class on relationships, and I'll go into it in more detail. But at the same time, you also have to recognize where it's coming from. You respond with compassion. Instead of, if you're just angry back, well, look at us. We get to keep reincarnating together to fight this out for God knows how long. You know, it's unwise to respond that way because you lock yourself into it. But just because they want something of you, Swami Kriyananda's amazingly kind, amazingly sensitive, and absolutely unmovable if your request of him is not right. You know? He's perfectly kind about it. He won't bother to say unkind things to you, but I remember once I was making him juice, and he had this certain idea of the combinations that he wanted, and God knows why, but I decided to impose upon something he didn't want. And, in retrospect, it's like, what was I thinking? But sometimes I think I'm right when I'm not always right. So he sort of told me what he wanted and why he wanted it, and I explained to him why I thought what I was going to give him was better. And the conversation ended there. I brought the juice to him, I set it on the table, he never touched it. He never said a word to me. He never corrected me, nothing. He just refused to touch it. He wasn't going to be bullied by me. Somebody's trying to bully you, you don't have to bully them back, but you also don't have to give in either. And there you have it. I believe that's the end of our time. So I hope to see some of you for the sequence of classes, because we can follow up on what we've started. And also, I'm not going anywhere, so I'm happy to stay and talk with you longer if any of you want to. And I think that's that.